They laughed when 68-year-old Evelyn Mercer spent nearly $500 on a truckload of rusted cattle fencing no one else wanted. Bent steel, broken posts, scrap from a ranch that had already gone under. Her neighbors said the old widow had finally wasted money on something even she could not fix. But Evelyn was not building a fence for cattle. She was preparing for a storm no one else believed would matter. 3 weeks later, the blizzard came. 50-mile-an-hour winds buried county roads beneath walls of snow. Snowplows were forced to stop. Farms disappeared behind white drifts. Families were stranded. And when a pregnant young woman went into labor with no road left to reach her, the only path still open ran straight across Evelyn's land, protected by the same rusted fencing everyone had mocked. What happened next would change how an entire town looked at the quiet old woman, her aging German Shepherd Ranger, and the things people throw away too quickly. Before we begin, tell me where you are watching from. Drop your country or state in the comments. I want to see how far Evelyn's story travels. And if you believe wisdom can come with age, if you believe forgotten things can still save lives, hit that subscribe button, because this story is about more than surviving a storm. It is about seeing danger before everyone else does, and having the courage to prepare while the world is still laughing. Every life carries a story, and every one of us deserves a place to share what lies within our hearts. You are here with Porchlight Stories, where every life is welcomed beneath the warm glow of the porch light. Subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you never miss another heartfelt story. Please stay with us until the very end. If today's story touches your heart, give the video a like and subscribe to support the channel. And if there is anything we could do better, please leave a comment and share your thoughts. And now, let's begin. At 8:35 on a Saturday morning in early January, Prairie Hollow, Kansas sat beneath a pale gray sky that seemed to stretch forever across the western plains. The temperature was 27 degrees Fahrenheit, cold enough to harden the mud along the gravel roads, but not cold enough to keep the wind from carrying dust through the harvested fields. A steady northwest breeze hissed through dry grass and rattled loose sheet metal on barns outside town. Prairie Hollow itself was little more than a grain elevator, 2 churches, a feed store, a diner, a gas station, and several blocks of houses gathered where 2 county roads met. Beyond it, the land opened into miles of winter-brown pasture and stubble fields with almost nothing to interrupt the wind. 6 miles west of town, the Barrow Creek Cattle Company was being sold piece by piece. For nearly 30 years, the operation had been one of the largest cattle outfits in the county. Its loading alleys had once echoed before sunrise, and its feed trucks had been familiar sights on every road around Prairie Hollow. But several years of poor margins, rising feed costs, aging equipment, and heavy debt had finally brought the business down. The cattle were already gone. Now the machinery, trailers, gates, feeders, fencing, and anything else that might bring a few dollars were spread across the property beneath numbered auction tags. By mid-morning, more than 60 buyers moved between the barns and corrals. Most were looking for tractors, hydraulic equipment, stock trailers, or anything they could put to work immediately. Evelyn Mercer stopped beside the things everyone else had passed. She was 68 years old, small and lean, with the kind of strength that came not from a gym but from decades of lifting feed sacks, pulling cabs, repairing fences, and climbing on tractors in every kind of weather. She stood about 5 feet 4 inches tall. Her silver-gray hair was tied loosely at the back of her neck beneath an old canvas cap, and fine lines framed a pair of gray-green eyes that had spent most of their life studying cattle, clouds, soil, machinery, and people. She wore a faded brown canvas coat over a blue flannel shirt, worn jeans, and dark leather boots polished smooth at the toes by years of use. 11 years earlier, she had lost her husband, Thomas Mercer, after a short illness. Since then, she had continued operating their 320-acre cattle farm alone. Thomas had once said Evelyn could stare at a broken machine for 10 minutes and find the one bolt everyone else had overlooked. His death had made her quieter, but it had never made her helpless. In front of her lay several stacks of old steel cattle panels, bent gates, rusty T-posts, and rolls of livestock fencing. Nobody seemed interested. Claire Mercer stopped beside her and stared at the pile. Claire was Evelyn's 29-year-old niece, tall, athletic, and almost a head higher than her aunt. She had light brown hair pulled into a practical ponytail, hazel eyes, and an expressive face that made skepticism difficult to hide. 4 months earlier, she had returned from Denver after leaving her job as a veterinary technician at a large animal hospital. She told everyone she simply needed a change, though Evelyn suspected there was more behind the decision and had chosen not to push. Claire loved animals, worked hard, and genuinely respected her aunt. But years in the city had taught her to trust equipment manuals, professional certifications, and things that arrived with warranties. Evelyn's habit of saving old wire, repairing machinery long after other people would replace it, and studying weather patterns from memory often struck Claire as charmingly outdated. Claire looked from the rusted fencing to Evelyn. "Please tell me you're not thinking about buying that." Evelyn pulled off one glove. "I'm thinking about looking at it." "That is usually how buying starts with you." Evelyn crouched beside the first panel and scraped her thumb across one of the horizontal rails. Brown rust came away beneath her glove, revealing solid gray metal underneath. She gripped the rail and shook it. The panel rattled, but held. She moved to another. This one had a badly corroded weld near the bottom corner. Evelyn pushed it aside. Claire watched her for another minute. "Aunt Evelyn, some of those things look like they've been sitting outside since I was born." "Probably longer." That wasn't an endorsement. Evelyn checked another T-post, rolling it beneath her boot to see whether it was straight. A voice behind them said, "Claire, you better stop her before she buys the whole graveyard." Wade Sutton approached with a paper cup of coffee in one hand. Wade was 56, broad-shouldered and heavy through the middle, with a thick gray mustache and carefully combed hair hidden beneath a tan ranch cap. He owned nearly 800 acres north of Prairie Hollow and had a reputation for doing almost everything on a larger scale than necessary. His pickup was new every few years, his tractors were among the biggest in the county, and his opinions usually arrived before anyone asked for them. Wade was not an unkind man. He helped neighbors when machinery broke and never ignored someone stranded on a road. But success had given him a confidence so deep that he often laughed at ideas he did not immediately understand. He kicked one of the panels lightly with the toe of his boot. "That pile's headed for scrap." "Some of it is," Evelyn said. Wade grinned. "You planning on starting a recycling business?" "No." "A modern art collection?" Claire laughed despite herself. Evelyn continued inspecting the steel. Wade looked at Claire. "What does she need more fence for?" "That is exactly what I'm trying to find out." Evelyn stood and brushed rust from her glove. "You two finished?" "Not even close," Wade said. "I've got material for another 10 minutes. The auctioneer reached the fencing late that morning. His name was Pete Lawson, a thin man in his early 60s with a red nose from the cold and a voice roughened by 30 years of livestock sales. By then, most buyers had already spent their money on machinery and trailers. Only a few people remained near the fencing. Pete started low. A scrap dealer offered $200. Another man raised him by 50. Evelyn lifted her bidding card. Claire turned toward her so quickly that her ponytail swung over her shoulder. "No." Evelyn ignored her. The bidding crept upward. 300, 350, 400. The scrap dealer hesitated. Hauling the material would cost almost as much as the steel might bring. Evelyn raised again. 475, Pete called. "I've got 475. Anybody give 5? Silence. 475 once. Claire stared at her aunt. Twice. Wade had already begun smiling. Sold. $475 to Evelyn Mercer. Wade laughed loud enough to turn several heads. "Evelyn, are you building a prison for your cows?" She folded her bidding number and slipped it into her coat pocket. "No." "Then you're opening a junkyard." "Not planning on that either." Wade shook his head. $475 for rust. Evelyn looked at him. You paid $68,000 for a pickup with heated cup holders. They're useful. So is steel. Claire pressed her lips together, trying not to laugh. For the next 2 hours, Evelyn sorted every piece she had bought. She did not simply load the whole pile. Panels with rusted-through joints went into one stack, T-posts badly twisted near the base went into another. She rejected woven fencing where corrosion had made the wire brittle enough to snap between her hands. But underneath the ugly surface, more of the material was usable than Claire had expected. Many panels were only weathered, their rails remained strong. Dozens of T-posts were straight. Several rolls of fencing had years of life left in them once the damaged ends were removed. By early afternoon, they had loaded the best material onto Evelyn's flatbed trailer and a borrowed second trailer. Claire climbed into the passenger seat of Evelyn's old Ford. "All right," she said. "Now that we own enough rusty fencing to disappoint an entire subdivision, where are we putting it?" Evelyn started the engine. "You'll see." The Mercer farm sat southwest of Prairie Hollow, surrounded by open pasture, wheat ground, and shelter belts planted generations earlier around farmsteads. Claire assumed they would unload beside the cattle pens. Evelyn drove past them. She passed the barn, then the machine shed. Then she followed a narrow farm track toward the southern side of the property. Claire looked over. "The corrals are back there." "I know where my corrals are." They stopped beside an open field bordering the farm's back road. There were no cattle in it, no horses, no garden, no equipment. Only winter grass, bare ground, and an enormous view toward the northwest. Evelyn climbed out and took several marking flags from behind the truck seat. Claire followed. "What are we doing here?" Evelyn walked away from the road, counting her steps. She stopped roughly 70 yards into the field and pushed a small orange flag into the ground. Then she walked east. Another flag. Then another. Slowly, a line began appearing across the field. Claire studied it. Something was wrong. The line was not parallel to the road. It was not following the property boundary. It did not divide one pasture from another. Instead, it crossed the open ground at a strange angle. Evelyn unloaded a steel T-post, positioned it beside the first flag, and lifted a heavy post driver over it. Metal struck metal with a hard, ringing sound. Once, twice, 3 times. The post sank into the cold Kansas ground. Claire finally walked over. "Aunt Evelyn?" Evelyn checked the post with one hand. "You're putting the fence the wrong way." Evelyn lifted another post from the trailer. "If I wanted it to follow the road." Claire pointed across the empty field. "There's nothing here. No cattle, no pasture division, no property line. What exactly are you trying to keep inside?" Evelyn stopped. The northwest wind brushed strands of silver hair loose beneath her cap. She turned toward the horizon. Far beyond the field, nothing moved except dry grass bending beneath the steady winter breeze. "Nothing," she said. Claire frowned. "Then what are you keeping out?" Evelyn studied the northwestern sky for several seconds. There was no storm there, only pale winter clouds and miles of open Kansas. Then she picked up the next rusted post. "Wait until the wind comes." Claire remained beside the first section of fencing, while Evelyn walked toward the next marker. Behind them sat hundreds of feet of steel that everyone at Barrow Creek had considered worthless. Ahead of them stretched an empty field that seemed to need no fence at all. And as the ringing of the post driver carried across the frozen ground, Claire began to wonder whether her aunt had spent $475 on somebody else's junk, or whether Evelyn Mercer had noticed something coming across those open plains that nobody else had thought to look for. 2 mornings after the Barrow Creek auction, Prairie Hollow woke beneath a sky the color of old tin. The temperature had fallen to 23 degrees Fahrenheit, and a steady northwest wind skimmed over the bare fields surrounding the Mercer farm, bending the winter grass flat in one direction, before letting it rise again. By 8 o'clock, Evelyn was already outside with a thermos of coffee resting on the tailgate of her Ford, a tape measure clipped to her belt, and several orange flags marking the strange diagonal line she had begun across the open field. Claire came through the back door carrying 2 mugs and found her aunt studying the road, then the field, then the northwestern horizon, as if the 3 were parts of the same equation. "You really are going to make me ask again, aren't you?" Claire said. Evelyn accepted the coffee. "Ask what?" "What the fence is supposed to do." Evelyn took a sip and nodded toward the road 70 yards behind them. "Keep that open." Claire looked from the rusty fence posts to the road. "By putting a fence over here?" "That's the idea." "For cattle?" "No cattle." "Then I'm officially lost." Evelyn set her mug down on the tailgate. "Snow." Claire waited. When Evelyn did not continue, she frowned. "You're fencing out snow?" "I'm giving it somewhere else to stop." That answer finally made Claire quiet. Evelyn walked several yards into the field and pointed northwest. For more than 4 decades, she had watched winter storms move across the high plains, first beside Thomas and later alone. She knew which shelter belts disappeared first, which north-south roads drifted shut after only a few inches of snowfall, and which open fields could feed snow into a road for hours after the clouds had cleared. She explained that people often blamed heavy snowfall when a road disappeared, but on the plains the amount falling from the sky was only half the story. Wind could scrape loose snow from hundreds of acres and carry it along the ground until something interrupted its path. A ditch, a hedge, a building, a fence. Once the air slowed, the snow dropped. "The worst drifts I remember didn't come from the biggest snowfall," Evelyn said. "They came from the biggest fetch." Claire tilted her head. "Fetch?" "Open distance, nothing stopping the wind." She pointed across the harvested ground stretching northwest of the Mercer property. There was almost a mile of bare field before the next shelter belt. "That field gives the wind plenty of room to collect snow." Claire studied it differently now. "So why not put the fence beside the road?" "Because then the snow lands beside the road." Evelyn walked back to the first orange flag. "You want the drift out here, not stacked against the shoulder. Give snow room to fall before the road gets involved." Claire looked at the 70 yards between them and the road. "You measured this?" "Several winters ago." "You've thought about building this before?" "For years." "Why didn't you?" "New fencing cost more than I wanted to spend on an experiment." Claire glanced toward the trailer filled with the unwanted Barrow Creek steel. "And then somebody sold you an experiment for $475. Evelyn allowed herself the smallest smile. "Now you're catching up." By mid-morning, another pickup turned into the farm lane. It was an old white Chevrolet with a rust spot over the rear wheel and a portable welding unit strapped behind the cab. Harold Boone climbed out slowly, favoring his right knee as he crossed the frozen yard. Harold was 72, tall but slightly stooped, with a long face, heavy white eyebrows, and hands so scarred and thickened by work that his knuckles looked carved from oak roots. He had spent most of his adult life building livestock fences, repairing corrals, and welding farm equipment throughout 3 counties. Retirement had lasted less than 6 months before he began accepting small jobs again because, as he often said, a man could only reorganize the same tool bench so many times. He was patient with machinery, impatient with foolishness, and known for examining every job quietly before saying whether it would work. Harold stopped beside the first section Evelyn had erected. "Ugly," he said. "Cheap," Evelyn replied. "Those two often travel together." Claire smiled. Harold walked along the material stacked by the trailer. He lifted one bent panel, sighted down its length, then laid it across 2 wooden blocks. "These aren't ruined," he said. "Most are just twisted." "That's what I thought." Harold pointed at Claire. "You pulling or pushing?" Claire blinked. "Apparently I'm participating now." "Good." Young backs are wasted on observation. For the next several days, the three of them worked whenever the ground and wind allowed. Harold heated badly bent sections near the welded joints, then used chains and the hydraulic drawbar of Evelyn's tractor to pull them back toward shape. Panels that were too damaged for full use were cut into shorter sections. Straight T-posts were driven along Evelyn's flagged line, spaced carefully enough to hold the steel, but not so closely that they wasted material. Claire's skepticism did not vanish overnight. She complained about frozen fingers, questioned Evelyn's spacing, and asked more than once whether they were putting a great deal of labor into an idea that might never matter. But she kept working. By the fourth day, she no longer had to be told which panels Harold considered salvageable. By the fifth, she was carrying the post driver before Evelyn asked for it. Ranger spent every day with them. He was Evelyn's 9-year-old male German shepherd, large without being heavy, with a black saddle over a warm tan coat, a broad chest, and a muzzle silvered by age. His left ear bent slightly outward at the tip, the result of an old farm injury when he had been younger and foolish enough to chase a raccoon beneath a broken gate. Ranger had never been trained as a police dog or service animal. He knew cattle, gates, pickup trucks, the sound of Evelyn's whistle, and almost every acre of the Mercer property. Age had made him deliberate. He rarely wasted energy barking when a long stare would do. Most mornings he chose a place beside the ford where the winter sun warmed the dirt and watched the humans work as though supervising a crew that continually disappointed him. Claire dropped a glove beside him one afternoon. Ranger lifted his head, looked at the glove, then at Claire. "You could bring that to me." He put his chin back on his paws. Harold laughed. "Smart dog." "How is ignoring me smart?" "He knows you'll come get it." Even Evelyn laughed at that. The fence grew steadily across the field. It did not form a solid wall. Air could pass through the openings, which Evelyn insisted was important. Claire wanted to close several gaps with woven wire, but Evelyn stopped her. "Too solid, and the wind rolls over it differently." Claire raised an eyebrow. "You've become a wind engineer now?" "No. I've repaired enough mistakes to know wind doesn't like being told what to do." On Thursday afternoon, Wade Sutton drove past on the back road and slowed when he saw them working. He eventually backed into the field entrance and walked over, hands buried in the pockets of his heavy ranch coat. "You actually built it," he said. "Part of it," Evelyn answered. Wade stared at the line. "Didn't even follow the road." "That's intentional." "You planning to explain that?" "Snow fence." Wade looked at Harold, then Claire, apparently waiting for somebody to grin. Nobody did. "A snow fence." "Yes." Wade looked toward the northwest and then back at Evelyn. "County bought 2 new plow trucks last year." "I heard." "Big ones, wing blades, better tires." "That's nice." "So if it snows, the county moves it." "If they can reach it." Wade chuckled. "Evelyn, we live in Kansas, not the Arctic." "You've lived here long enough to know better than that." "I've lived here long enough to know every old-timer predicts the winter of '78 every January." Harold leaned against a post. "And eventually one of them gets to say, 'I told you so.'" Wade laughed. "Fine. When the blizzard of the century arrives, I'll come apologize to the fence." Before leaving, he called through his open truck window. "Make sure you put up a sign! Evelyn Mercer Memorial Snow Wall." Claire watched his pickup disappear. "He is going to be unbearable if this does nothing." Evelyn picked up another T-post. "Then let him be unbearable." 3 nights later, a small weather system crossed western Kansas. The forecast called for only 3 inches of snow, hardly enough to alarm anyone. It began after dark, light powder whispering across the windows of the Mercer farmhouse, while the wind held around 25 miles per hour. Claire glanced outside before going to bed and saw nothing remarkable. The yard was white. The road was white. The world looked exactly as winter should. By sunrise, the snow had stopped. Claire pulled on her boots and went outside with Ranger following several steps behind. She expected the field to be evenly covered. It was not. A long white drift had formed on the downwind side of Evelyn's fence, thickest near the middle and tapering gradually at both ends. The snow piled there in a broad, smooth ridge, while the ground closer to the back road showed only a thin, wind-polished layer. Claire walked toward the fence. She pushed one boot into the drift until the snow came nearly to her knee. Then she turned and looked at the road. It was almost clear. Evelyn came from the barn carrying a bucket. Claire pointed. "You knew that would happen." "I hoped." "This much snow came out of 3 inches?" "It didn't come out of 3 inches." Evelyn pointed across the wide fields northwest of them. "It came out of all that." Claire looked over the open country and finally understood what her aunt had meant by fetch. The field was acting like a reservoir, not of water, but of loose snow, and the wind had spent the night draining it toward the first thing that slowed it down. She looked at the old steel fence again. For the first time since the auction, she did not make a joke. That evening, the temperature fell quickly after sunset. Claire made soup, while Evelyn sat at the kitchen table repairing a leather glove. Ranger slept near the stove, occasionally twitching one paw in a dream. At 7:15, the weather radio interrupted its regular forecast. Claire turned up the volume. A new Arctic air mass was moving south through the northern plains. The system was strengthening faster than forecasters had expected. Snowfall totals remained uncertain, but the greater concern was wind. Gusts across western Kansas could exceed 50 miles per hour, producing widespread blowing snow and dangerous travel conditions. Claire stopped stirring the soup. 50? Evelyn put down the glove. The meteorologist continued, describing a possible shift in the storm track. A map appeared on the television in the corner of the kitchen, showing the expected path curving southeast through western Kansas. Evelyn stood and walked closer. Claire watched her face. There was no triumph in it. No satisfaction that the forecast might prove her right. Only concentration. Evelyn traced the projected movement with one finger without touching the screen. Northwest to southeast, across open ground, directly toward Prairie Hollow. Claire suddenly remembered where her aunt had been looking the day she drove the first post into the field. The same horizon, the same direction. "What?" Claire asked quietly. Evelyn did not answer immediately. The forecast map updated again, tightening the projected path. Then Evelyn finally spoke. "That's the wind I was waiting for." By 7 the next morning, Prairie Hollow, Kansas, had already begun to change. The temperature had fallen to 18 degrees Fahrenheit, and the northwest sky carried a dull blue-gray weight that made the grain elevator at the edge of town look darker than usual. The Weather Service had upgraded its advisory overnight, and people who had laughed about the forecast the day before were suddenly filling pickup beds with groceries, propane bottles, livestock feed, and fuel cans. At Nelson's Market, the bread shelves emptied before noon. At the Prairie Hollow Co-op, trucks lined up beside the diesel pumps, yet back at the Mercer farm, Evelyn did not join the rush. She had started preparing before most people had decided there was anything to prepare for. Her first concern was the cattle. She moved 2 additional round bales of hay into the sheltered feeding area near the barn, positioning them where she could reach them without crossing the open lot if visibility collapsed. Claire helped roll a 3rd bale into place with the tractor, then watched as Evelyn climbed down and checked the barn doors, hinges, water lines, and latches one by one. There was nothing hurried about her movements. She worked as though she were following a list written years earlier. "You do this every time snow is forecast?" Claire asked. "Not like this." That answer made Claire pay closer attention. Evelyn went next to the equipment shed where an aging portable generator sat beneath a canvas cover. It was a compact diesel unit with scratched green paint and one replaced wheel, purchased second-hand nearly 15 years earlier. Evelyn checked the oil, inspected the fuel line, cleaned corrosion from one battery terminal, and started it long enough to hear the engine settle into a steady rhythm. Claire stood nearby with her hands in her jacket pockets. "You think we'll lose power?" "I think power lines don't care what I think." She shut the generator down and filled 2 spare fuel cans. After that came the tractor. Evelyn topped off the diesel tank, checked the battery here, inspected the hydraulic hoses, and parked the machine nose out in the shed so she would not have to maneuver it if snow piled around the doors. Claire finally said, "This feels less like getting ready for weather and more like getting ready for a siege." Evelyn closed the tractor hood. Storm doesn't need permission to make the difference irrelevant. The last preparation confused Claire most. Evelyn pulled a bundle of 6-foot fiberglass reflector stakes from the storage loft, each topped with bright orange reflective tape, and carried them toward the back road. She began placing them at intervals along both sides of the private track leading from the farmyard toward the southern field and beyond the snow fence. Claire followed with another bundle. "What are these for?" "So we know where the road is." "The road isn't going anywhere." "The road doesn't have to go anywhere. We only have to stop being able to see it." They worked for nearly an hour, driving the markers deep enough that 4 feet remained above the ground. Evelyn placed extra stakes at bends, culverts, and the narrow section where a shallow drainage ditch ran close to the road. Claire watched her measure one spot twice. "You really think we could lose the whole road under snow?" Evelyn pushed the stake deeper. "I've seen it happen." Claire leaned on the next marker. "When?" Evelyn looked across the dormant pasture before answering. 34 years ago. At the time, Evelyn had been 34, and Thomas was still alive. Their farm had been smaller then, their barn newer, and Claire had not yet been born. The storm had come late in January, after several days of dry powder snow. Forecasts had called for bad weather, but no one expected the wind to become the main problem. Evelyn remembered looking from the farmhouse window and seeing snow move sideways so fast that fence posts disappeared and returned like objects beneath white water. "The county bridge stayed standing," Evelyn said as they walked back toward the truck. "Not a scratch on it." "So what failed?" "Nothing. People were watching." She explained that the main road north of their property had been plowed repeatedly. County crews had working equipment. 2 graders, a truck plow, and farmers with tractors had all joined in. But every time they cleared the exposed stretch south of the bridge, wind swept more loose snow out of the western fields and filled the road again. "They'd cut a lane," Evelyn said, and 2 hours later it was nearly gone. Claire frowned. "Then they cleared it again." "They tried." "What stopped them?" "Time, fuel, visibility, and too many miles of road." The problem had not been that the county lacked machines. It was that one machine could only be in one place at a time. When several roads drifted shut together, every family assumed its route would be opened next. Evelyn remembered one neighbor who had driven out after hearing that the bridge was open. He reached the bridge easily, crossed it, then found the road beyond buried beneath a drift taller than his hood. He backed up nearly half a mile because there was nowhere to turn. "The bridge was fine," Evelyn said. "The road was technically fine underneath the snow. None of that mattered. You couldn't use either one." Claire understood the point before Evelyn finished. Everyone depended on one route. Evelyn nodded. "That's what stranded people. Not one broken bridge, not one dead plow. They all trusted the same road." Later that afternoon, Wade Sutton stopped by while Evelyn was unloading another bale near the barn. He had 2 50-gallon diesel transfer tanks strapped into the bed of his pickup and several sacks of cattle minerals stacked behind the cab. "Looks like you're expecting the end of civilization," he called. Evelyn glanced at his fuel load. "Looks like you're expecting something too." Wade grinned. "I'm expecting weather. Difference is, I trust machinery." He told them County 14 would remain the priority route because it connected several farms to Prairie Hollow. The county had 2 newer plow trucks, each equipped with wing blades, plus a grader available if conditions worsened. "They'll keep 14 open," Wade said. "Cal told me himself." As if summoned by the conversation, a yellow county pickup appeared on the road half an hour later. It slowed beside the Mercer entrance and turned in. Cal Turner stepped out. Cal was 48, medium height and thick through the shoulders, with a close-cropped brown and gray beard, weather-reddened cheeks, and the permanently tired eyes of someone accustomed to receiving complaints about problems he did not create. He had supervised county road maintenance for 11 years and had worked on graders and plows long before that. Cal was practical rather than boastful, but responsibility had taught him to speak with confidence even when forecasts remained uncertain. During severe weather, hundreds of residents expected his small crew to keep hundreds of miles of rural roads passable. He had stopped to inspect a culvert farther south and noticed the reflective stakes. "Getting serious, Evelyn?" "I prefer visible roads." Cal nodded toward the snow fence. "Heard about your project. Wade advertise it?" "Wade advertises everything." Wade laughed. Cal looked toward the horizon. "We've got both plows serviced, graders fueled, chains are loaded. Crew starts early tomorrow. County 14 gets priority." Wade gave Evelyn a look that said exactly what he had predicted. Claire asked, "Can you keep it open if the wind really gets over 50? Cal paused before answering. "We can keep working it as long as we can see where we're going." It was a careful answer, Evelyn noticed. Wade apparently did not. "See," he said. "Prepared." Evelyn simply nodded. "Good." She did not argue about the storm 34 years earlier. She did not tell Cal where she believed the worst drift would form. She did not point again toward the open western fields. Instead, she went back to work. By dusk, the temperature had dropped into the low teens. Claire carried firewood onto the covered porch, while Evelyn checked the generator one last time. Ranger followed them, but seemed more restless than usual. Normally, the old German shepherd settled near the kitchen stove as soon as evening chores were finished. That night, he remained outside. At 9 o'clock, Claire opened the front door and found him standing at the edge of the porch. His body was still. His nose pointed northwest. "Ranger?" One ear turned toward her, but he did not move. Claire stepped outside. The air felt different. The breeze that had blown steadily all afternoon was sharpening into gusts. Somewhere beyond the darkened fields, loose metal clattered against a shed. Evelyn joined her at the doorway. "He won't come in." "He will." "What's he doing?" "Listening." A stronger gust swept across the yard. Ranger lifted his nose, smelling something carried through the darkness. Then he turned and walked inside. Near midnight, the wind began striking the farmhouse in long, low bursts. It pushed beneath the eaves and made the old window glass tremble in its frames. Claire woke twice to hear snow ticking against the bedroom window like handfuls of sand. At 5:42 the next morning, Evelyn was already in the kitchen. The weather radio sat on the table beside her coffee. Outside, there was almost no sunrise, only a pale, white-gray glow beyond swirling snow. Claire entered in socks and a sweatshirt. "How bad?" Evelyn turned up the radio. The announcer's voice came through beneath static. County road crews had temporarily suspended plowing outside the immediate Prairie Hollow area. Visibility in open country had fallen close to zero, and several drivers had reported losing sight of road edges, even with headlights and emergency flashers. Claire looked toward Evelyn. "They stopped?" "For now." "But County 14 is outside town." A moment later, the kitchen lights flickered. Once. Twice. Then the farmhouse went dark. The refrigerator fell silent. The furnace fans stopped. Claire froze. Ranger lifted his head from the floor. Evelyn was already reaching for the flashlight she kept beside the weather radio. "Generator," she said. Before Claire could move, the telephone rang. The old landline sounded unnaturally loud in the dark kitchen. Once. Twice. Evelyn stared at it. Very few people called that early unless something had happened. On the third ring, she picked up the receiver. "This is Evelyn." For several seconds, she said nothing. Claire watched her face change. Not fear. Recognition. The quiet expression of a woman hearing confirmation that somewhere beyond the walls of her farmhouse, somebody had discovered too late that the road everyone trusted was no longer enough. The storm swallowed Prairie Hollow before sunrise. By 6:30 that morning, the temperature had dropped to 12 degrees Fahrenheit, and the northwest wind was driving snow across western Kansas in long, horizontal sheets that erased fence lines, ditches, and sometimes entire buildings from view. Barely 13 inches of snow had fallen since the previous evening, but snowfall totals no longer mattered. The wind was doing the real damage. Gusts above 50 miles per hour tore loose powder from hundreds of acres of wheat stubble and pasture, carrying it across open country until it struck whatever interrupted the flow. By mid-morning, drifts were piling as high as pickup doors in some places and above the hoods in others. County Road 14, the route everyone had assumed would remain open, had almost disappeared. The telephone call Evelyn had answered in the dark kitchen that morning had been from Wade Sutton. His usual confidence was gone. He told her the road north of his property was blocked at 2 separate rises and that the lane from his cattle yard had already filled with drifting snow. He had tried pushing through with his 4-wheel drive pickup before visibility collapsed, but after less than a quarter mile he turned around because he could no longer distinguish the road from the ditch. Evelyn listened without reminding him of anything he had said about her fence. Wade did not need humiliation. He needed weather to improve. By 9 o'clock, the radio reported that 2 livestock feed trucks headed toward ranches north and west of Prairie Hollow had been forced to turn back. One driver made it only 5 miles beyond town before encountering a drift stretching across the road like a white embankment. The second tried an alternate county route, only to find blowing snow filling the tracks almost as quickly as vehicles made them. Neither driver was willing to risk putting a loaded truck into a ditch where recovery equipment could not reach it. Then came worse news. One of Cal Turner's county plows had slid off the edge of a road west of town. The driver was unhurt, but the truck had dropped far enough into the ditch that its rear wheels lost traction. With visibility still near zero and towing equipment unable to reach the site safely, Cal ordered it abandoned until conditions improved. That left the county with fewer machines and more road than ever. Claire stood beside the battery-powered radio in Evelyn's kitchen, listening as one closure after another was announced. "So this is what you meant," she said. Evelyn was pulling on insulated gloves. "This is part of it." Claire looked toward the white windows. "County 14 is just gone?" "The gravel is still there." "You know what I mean." Evelyn nodded. "Nobody can use a road they can't find." The generator was running outside beneath a vented lean-to, keeping the furnace circulation pump and several essential circuits alive. The cattle were sheltered with hay already placed where Evelyn wanted it. Nothing required immediate attention near the barns, so when the wind eased slightly before noon, Evelyn decided it was time to inspect the back road. Claire went with her. Ranger followed before either woman invited him. The old German shepherd stepped into the snow with the deliberate caution of an animal whose age had taught him that frozen ground could hide holes. His black and tan coat was quickly dusted white along the shoulders, and his silvered muzzle pointed into the wind as he followed Evelyn toward the southern field. They could not see the snow fence from the farmhouse. For the first 100 yards, Claire relied almost entirely on the orange reflector stakes they had installed. Each one appeared through the blowing snow, then vanished behind them as they moved forward. Without them, the edge of the road would have been almost impossible to distinguish from the shallow ditch beside it. When the field finally opened in front of them, Claire stopped. The fence was almost hidden. Not because it had failed, because it was holding an enormous drift. A long ridge of snow had formed on the downwind side of the rusted steel panels, thicker and higher than the smaller drift Claire had seen after the first test storm. In several places, the white bank rose nearly to the top rails. Farther away from the fence, its depth tapered gradually until the field surface became visible again. Claire turned toward the back road. She stared. The road was still there. Wind had swept a thin layer across it, and several shallow drifts had formed near a bend. But the route had not been buried under the enormous volume accumulating against the fence. Evelyn walked to the nearest reflector stake and kicked through the snow beside it. "Still firm." Claire looked back toward the giant drift. "That was all headed for the road?" "Not every bit. But a lot of it, yes." For several seconds, Claire said nothing. The fence still looked ugly. Rusted panels, repaired bends, mismatched posts salvaged from a bankrupt cattle operation. Yet the proof stood directly in front of her. Wade had seen junk, Claire had seen junk, Evelyn had seen a place for the wind to leave its burden before reaching the road. Claire laughed once, softly, almost in disbelief. You really paid $475 for that? Evelyn glanced at her. Still think I overpaid? Claire looked at the visible track behind them. No, it was the first time she answered without teasing. They walked farther along the route. It was not perfect. One stretch had 6 inches of loose powder over the surface. Another had a shallow drift where the ground dipped. Evelyn marked both places mentally. But a 4-wheel drive vehicle with adequate clearance could still move through. By early afternoon, conditions worsened again, and they returned to the farmhouse. The wind hammered the building until the porch light vibrated against its bracket. Ranger settled beside the kitchen door, but every strong gust raised his head. Claire heated soup on the gas stove while Evelyn checked the radio and made notes on an old road map. At 2:47 p.m., the telephone rang again. This time, Wade was shouting before Evelyn could say hello. "It's Emily!" Evelyn straightened. Emily Sutton was Wade's 31-year-old daughter-in-law, married to his only son, Nathan. She was a slender young woman with dark blonde hair, soft brown eyes, and the calm temperament of someone who usually made other people slow down simply by speaking quietly. She had grown up outside Wichita before marrying Nathan 6 years earlier and moving to Prairie Hollow, where she taught 2nd grade until taking maternity leave. Emily was 38 weeks pregnant with their first child. Her doctor had told her the baby might arrive any time within the next 2 weeks, but until that afternoon, she had shown no clear signs of labor. "What happened?" Evelyn asked. "Contractions." "How far apart?" There was muffled conversation on Wade's end. 8 minutes, maybe 7 now. Claire had already moved closer. "Her water broken?" "Not yet. Nathan's with her. We called emergency dispatch." "What did they say?" "That's the problem." Wade's voice dropped. "They can't get here. County Road 14 was blocked between Prairie Hollow and the Sutton property. A rescue vehicle had attempted to approach from the north but turned back after encountering a drift deeper than its bumper. Another route was technically open on the eastern side, but reaching the Sutton farm from it required crossing several miles of exposed gravel roads that were rapidly filling. Evelyn called Cal directly. He answered after several rings, his voice buried beneath engine noise and radio chatter. "Tell me you've got better news than everybody else." "Emily Sutton's in labor." "I know." "How long until you can get 14 open?" Cal was silent for a moment. "We're trying." "How long?" "Best case, few hours." "And worst?" "I don't know." The answer carried more weight than anything else he could have said. Cal explained that the remaining plow was clearing priority stretches closer to town, while a grader worked toward the blocked section from the south. But every pass exposed the same problem Evelyn had warned about. Wind was pushing snow back into open sections almost immediately. "We cut through one drift," Cal said, "and another starts forming behind us." Claire heard him through the receiver. "Can an ambulance wait on the East Road?" Evelyn asked. "If you can get Emily there, yes. I can have volunteers stage near East Prairie Road, but I can't tell you I can reach the Sutton place from 14. Evelyn thanked him and hung up. For a moment the kitchen was silent, except for the generator humming outside and snow striking the windows. Claire looked at the road map spread across the table. The Sutton farm lay northwest, Prairie Hollow lay northeast, County Road 14 was the obvious route between them. The obvious route was gone. Then Claire noticed Evelyn was not looking at County 14, she was looking south, at the back road. It crossed Mercer land beyond the snow fence, continued through an old pasture gate, curved east beside a shelter belt, and eventually connected with East Prairie Road several miles away. Claire traced it with one finger. "This goes through. On paper. You've driven it. In summer. Not in this. No. The first mile ran behind Evelyn's property, where the snow fence had protected much of the route. Beyond that, the track crossed open pasture and passed an abandoned farmstead before reaching the eastern gravel road. Nobody had ever tried using the entire route during a storm like this. Wade called again. Emily's contractions were closer. Nathan was preparing blankets and a hospital bag, even though they had nowhere to take them. Claire looked at Evelyn. Evelyn looked through the kitchen window toward the southern field, where orange reflector stakes appeared and disappeared through blowing snow. Then she folded the map. She reached for her brown canvas coat. Ranger had been lying beside the door. The moment Evelyn pulled on her boots, the old German shepherd rose. His bent left ear lifted as far as it could. Claire stared at the dog, then at her aunt. "You're thinking about taking the back road." Evelyn zipped her coat. "I'm thinking County 14 isn't a road right now." Outside, the wind screamed across Prairie Hollow, burying the route everyone had trusted. But behind the Mercer farm, beneath the shadow of a rusted fence nobody had wanted, another road was still visible. And somewhere on the other side of the storm, a young woman and her unborn child were running out of time. Evelyn did not drive into the storm simply because Emily Sutton needed help. At 68, she had lived long enough to know that urgency could kill people just as easily as hesitation. For nearly 40 minutes, she stood at the kitchen window watching the orange reflector stakes beyond the barn appear and disappear inside the blowing snow. At times, the nearest marker vanished completely. Then the wind would ease for 30 seconds, and 3 or 4 stakes would return, faint orange lines standing above the white ground. Evelyn waited for those intervals to grow longer. Claire paced between the kitchen table and the telephone, checking on Emily every few minutes through Wade. Her contractions were becoming stronger, but she was still conscious, stable, and able to speak. That gave Evelyn something more valuable than speed: a little time. Claire contacted Prairie Hollow Volunteer Rescue through the county dispatcher. The rescue unit was a small organization made up mostly of farmers, mechanics, teachers, and former medical workers who covered the rural areas beyond the town ambulance district. The dispatcher told Claire that one of their 4-wheel drive medical SUVs had managed to reach East Prairie Road from town and could wait at the eastern entrance to the old Mercer route if Evelyn could guide them through. The driver was Travis Cole, 44, a broad, quiet man with a shaved head, a reddish beard, and the heavy forearms of someone who spent his weekdays repairing agricultural equipment. Travis had volunteered with the rescue service for nearly 12 years after losing a close friend in a farm accident where help had arrived too late. Since then, he took rural emergencies personally, but he was disciplined enough not to confuse courage with recklessness. Riding beside him was Janet Reeves, a 53-year-old volunteer EMT with short dark hair streaked with gray, wireframe glasses, and a calm voice that rarely changed even when everyone around her was frightened. She had worked as a nurse before reducing her hours to care for her aging mother, and she was known around Prairie Hollow for being able to make nervous patients listen without ever raising her voice. At 3:26 p.m., Claire received their radio call. "We're at East Prairie," Travis said through static. "Visibility may be 200 yards when the gusts drop, less when they pick up." Evelyn looked through the window again. 4 reflector stakes were visible, then 5. "That's enough," she said. She pulled on her insulated coat, wool cap, and gloves. Claire was already dressed. Ranger had been lying near the kitchen door, but the moment Evelyn reached for the truck keys, the old German shepherd stood and stretched stiffly. His silvered muzzle lifted toward her. "You're staying in the cab," Evelyn told him. Ranger wagged his tail once. Claire opened the rear door of the Ford, and he climbed carefully onto the bench seat. Evelyn drove. Claire sat beside her with the radio, road map, blankets, flashlight, tow straps, and a small emergency bag at her feet. Ranger settled behind them, his body angled so he could see through the windshield between the seats. The Ford moved no faster than 15 miles per hour. Evelyn did not follow the appearance of the snow. She followed the reflectors. One stake, then the next, then the next. The road beneath them was covered in loose powder, but the tires continued to find packed ground. Outside the protected corridor, enormous drifts stretched across the field like frozen waves. In places, the old Barrow Creek fencing was almost invisible behind the snow it had collected. The white ridges rose several feet high, yet the track running behind them remained wide enough for the pickup. Claire stared through the passenger window. If Mall snow was over here, we wouldn't be driving. The realization sounded different now than it had beside the small test drift. This was no experiment anymore. They were moving through a blizzard on a road that still existed because hundreds of dollars of unwanted steel had forced the wind to unload somewhere else. At the eastern junction, Travis's white rescue SUV emerged through the blowing snow, emergency lights flashing dimly against the white landscape. Evelyn stopped beside it and lowered her window. Travis leaned out. "You lead. I stay in your tracks." "If you lose my taillights, stop," Evelyn said. "Understood. Don't guess. I won't." They turned northwest toward the Sutton property. The next portion of the route was rougher. Evelyn had extended several sections of snow fencing along the worst open stretches, but there were gaps where old pasture lanes passed through shelter belts and livestock gates. Wind pushed snow across those exposed areas in shallow, moving sheets. Halfway through the second pasture, the reflector stakes became harder to see. Claire leaned forward. "Next one should be left of that cottonwood." "I know." A gust struck the truck broadside. For several seconds, the world disappeared. Evelyn stopped. She did not inch forward. She waited with one foot on the brake while snow raced across the hood. When the gust weakened, an orange reflector appeared 20 yards ahead. "There." They continued. Near an old cattle gate at the southwest corner of the pasture, Ranger suddenly rose behind them. His nails clicked against the floor mat. Claire looked back. "What is it?" Ranger stared through the windshield toward the right side of the track. His ears were forward, including the damaged left one as far as it could lift. He made no sound. Evelyn slowed. Ranger shifted his weight and continued staring. Claire looked ahead. "I don't see anything." "Neither do I." Evelyn stopped completely. She opened the door and stepped into knee-deep blowing snow with Claire following. Ranger remained in the truck at Evelyn's command. They walked several yards forward, probing the surface with a fiberglass marker. On the third step, Claire's pole suddenly dropped nearly 2 feet. She froze. Evelyn cleared snow with her boot. A narrow drainage ditch lay beneath them. Claire looked back toward the truck. "I would have driven straight into that." The ditch was normally obvious, a shallow depression beside the old gate where spring runoff crossed the pasture. But wind had filled it level with the surrounding ground, turning it into a smooth white trap. Claire looked at Ranger through the windshield. He knew. He remembered. Years earlier, before that gate had stopped being used regularly, Ranger had followed Evelyn through the pasture almost daily while she moved cattle. The dog knew where the old fence line turned and where the ditch separated the gate from the road. There was nothing supernatural about it. He simply recognized a place whose shape the snow had hidden from human eyes. Evelyn backed the pickup 20 yards, swung farther left, and crossed where the drainage channel narrowed over firmer ground. Travis followed exactly. The Sutton farm appeared 40 minutes later. Wade was already outside. The man who had joked about Evelyn's rusty snow fence now stood in blowing snow without a trace of humor on his face. His heavy coat was unzipped, and fear had hollowed the confidence from his expression. "You made it. Where's Emily?" "Inside." Nathan Sutton met them at the door. He was 33, tall and lean like his father had been before middle age broadened him, with sandy brown hair, tired blue eyes, and a usually easygoing manner that had disappeared beneath worry. He carried his wife's hospital bag in one hand. Emily was seated in the living room. Her dark blonde hair had been tied hastily behind her head. She was pale but alert, one hand resting beneath her belly, while Janet knelt beside her and timed another contraction. 6 minutes, Janet said after it passed. "Strong, but we have time if we move now." Emily tried to smile at Evelyn. "I suppose this is one way to make an entrance." Evelyn smiled back. Let's save the dramatic entrance for the baby. Even Wade managed a weak laugh. They bundled Emily into the medical SUV with blankets around her legs. Janet sat beside her in the rear, while Nathan climbed in as well. Wade started toward his own truck. Evelyn stopped him. Leave it. I can follow. We don't need another vehicle to dig out. For once, Wade did not argue. He climbed into the rear of Evelyn's Ford beside Ranger and Claire. They turned back toward the east. The first miles went better than expected. Their previous tire tracks remained faintly visible, and the snow fence continued doing its work. Travis kept the medical SUV close behind. Then they passed the old cattle gate. The hidden ditch was avoided. The reflectors led them onward. For the first time since leaving the Sutton house, Claire began to believe they might actually reach East Prairie Road without another problem. Then Evelyn slowed. Ahead stood the abandoned Miller place. The farm had been empty for 9 years. Its farmhouse roof had partly collapsed, and an old red barn leaned noticeably toward the south. The route skirted the northern edge of the property before turning east. That section had no snow fence. Evelyn had never finished it. She rounded the shelter belt and stopped. Claire whispered, "Oh no." A wall of snow crossed the entire road. It stretched from the shelter belt on one side to a drainage embankment on the other, packed hard by hours of northwest wind. In the deepest section, the drift rose almost to the hood of the Ford. There was no visible track through it, no space around it. Travis stopped the rescue SUV behind them. He walked forward, pushed a shovel into the drift, and immediately struck dense, wind-packed snow. "We're not driving through that," he said. Wade stared at the wall from the passenger side of the Ford. For the first time, he seemed to understand exactly how little distance separated success from failure. Miles of road behind them were open. Hundreds of feet of old fencing had worked. Yet the final, unprotected stretch had become impassable. From the medical SUV, Janet called over the radio. "Evelyn!" Claire answered. "What is it?" There was a short pause. "Emily's contractions are closer now." "How close?" 4 minutes. Claire slowly lowered the radio. Evelyn looked at the enormous drift blocking the last section of road. Beyond it, East Prairie Road and the waiting route to town lay less than a mile away. Behind them sat a woman whose baby had apparently decided not to wait for the county, the snowplows, or anyone else. Evelyn had kept almost the entire road alive. Almost. And standing before that single white wall, she knew that sometimes one forgotten 100 yards was enough to make every mile that came before it worthless. The wall of snow near the abandoned Miller place looked less like weather than something constructed. Wind had packed it across the road from the shelter belt to the drainage embankment, filling the last 100 yards of the route beneath a hard, white mass, nearly level with the hood of Evelyn's Ford. Beyond it lay East Prairie Road, and beyond that waited the ambulance route back toward Prairie Hollow. They were close enough that, on a clear day, Evelyn could have walked the distance in minutes. But at 4:38 that winter afternoon, with the temperature hovering near 9 degrees Fahrenheit and northwest gusts still driving loose snow over the tops of the drifts, those 100 yards might as well have been 10 miles. Inside the rescue SUV behind them, Emily Sutton's contractions had shortened to roughly 4 minutes apart. Janet Reeves remained calm, speaking quietly to Emily and checking her breathing. But the look she exchanged with Claire through the windshield carried a message no one needed translated. They had to move. Travis Cole walked to the front of the drift with a shovel, drove the blade into the packed snow, and immediately hit resistance. "We could dig," he said, "but not fast enough." Wade stepped beside him and stared at the white wall, as if anger might create a road through it. A month earlier, he might have blamed the county, the weather service, or somebody's failure to bring the right machine. Now he simply asked, "What else is there?" Evelyn did not answer immediately. She stood facing the old Miller farmstead, where the collapsed roof of the farmhouse was barely visible through blowing snow. Beyond the house, a row of low hedge trees stretched south before disappearing into white. Something about the angle of those trees pulled at a memory. She had been through that property dozens of times when the Miller family still ran cattle there. Thomas had traded pasture use with old Frank Miller during dry summers, and Evelyn had sometimes helped move cattle between the two farms. There had been another route. Not a road exactly. A cattle lane. "It runs behind the Miller place," she said. Claire turned. "Runs where?" "South side of the old barn, then east along that hedge line, comes back out beyond this drift." Travis looked toward the trees. "Can a truck fit?" "It used to." "How long ago?" Evelyn considered that. "Maybe 12 years since I drove it. Longer since anybody maintained it." Wade exhaled through his nose. "That's encouraging." Evelyn ignored the remark, not because it annoyed her, but because they no longer had time for sarcasm. The old lane crossed a pasture before reaching a gate near the hedge line. If the gate was still standing, it would put them behind the section of road where the drift had formed. The problem was finding it. The pasture had no reflector stakes, no snow fence, no visible tire tracks. Wind had flattened the entire landscape into one broad sheet of white. Claire looked toward the rescue SUV. "Can Emily wait while we search?" Janet stepped out long enough to answer. Snow immediately collected in the shoulders of her coat. "She's stable. Baby's heartbeat sounds good, but contractions are stronger. If there's another route, now is the time to find it." Evelyn returned to the Ford. Ranger had been sitting upright on the rear seat, watching the people move between vehicles. When Evelyn opened the door, the old German shepherd leaned forward. His dark saddle coat was dry inside the cab, but his silver muzzle had collected a little frost from the cold air entering through the door. "Come on," Evelyn said. Claire looked at her. "You're taking him?" "I'm taking myself. He's coming with me." Ranger jumped carefully down, landed in the snow, and immediately slowed. He did not race ahead or pull as though he knew some hidden destination. He sniffed the air, looked toward the tree line, then turned back to Evelyn. They left the vehicles idling and walked south along the edge of the abandoned property. Travis followed with a shovel. Wade came too, carrying a flashlight even though dusk had not fully arrived. Snow reached mid-cal in places, and nearly to their knees, where the wind had deposited it behind weeds and low shrubs. Evelyn searched for landmarks. The old windmill was gone. The stock tank she remembered had either been removed or buried. A machinery shed had collapsed years earlier. The landscape she carried in her memory still existed, but many of the objects that had anchored it were missing. "There should be a gate somewhere ahead," Evelyn said. Claire swept the flashlight across the field. "I don't see a fence. Most of it was taken out. That helps." Evelyn almost smiled, despite the circumstances. The gate posts might still be there. They advanced another 50 yards. Ranger stopped, his nose lifted toward the row of hedge trees. Then he moved several steps left. Evelyn called him back. He returned immediately, but when they started forward again, he angled toward the same trees. Claire noticed. "He keeps wanting to go that way." "He used to." "What?" "Follow me through here." Years earlier, Ranger had been a younger dog with black around his muzzle and far too much enthusiasm for cattle. When Evelyn drove cows through the Miller Lane, he had learned that the old gate near the hedgerow was the place where everyone slowed, shouted, and waited. Dogs remembered patterns humans sometimes forgot, especially patterns repeated hundreds of times. But Evelyn did not pretend he knew whether the gate still existed. "Ranger remembers where we used to go," she said. "That doesn't mean the lane is usable." They followed his general direction. 20 yards later, Evelyn lost confidence in the line. The world ahead looked completely flat. Even the hedge trees appeared misplaced through the blowing snow. "Gate should be here," she said. Claire began probing the snow with the shovel handle. Nothing. She moved farther right. Nothing. Ranger stood near the tree line, looking toward a patch of white ground beside a low shrub. Claire went toward him, thrust the shovel handle down, and felt it strike something solid. "Wait!" She knelt and brushed snow away with both gloves. A weathered wooden point appeared. Post. Evelyn came over. It was the top of an old cedar gate post, barely 6 inches above the snow. Claire dug beside it until a length of wire appeared, then traced the buried line across the opening. The metal gate itself had sagged nearly flat beneath accumulated snow, but it was still attached at one hinge. There, Evelyn said. Travis joined them, and together they cleared enough snow to lift the gate. The lower hinge had rusted through years earlier, which turned out to be a blessing. 4 people dragged the gate sideways, instead of trying to swing it. Beyond the opening, the old cattle lane dipped briefly behind the hedgerow. The trees had blocked enough wind that the snow there was noticeably shallower. Evelyn walked another 100 yards, testing the ground with the shovel. The lane curved east exactly as she remembered. Farther ahead, through a break in the trees, she could see the orange flash of a county road marker. East Prairie Road. "We can get through," she said. They returned to the vehicles. Travis insisted on walking the first stretch ahead of the Ford, while Evelyn followed at crawling speed. The lane was rough, and branches scraped along both sides of the truck. Once, Evelyn had to stop while Wade and Claire cut away a fallen limb using a folding saw from the rescue vehicle. But the ground beneath the snow remained firm. Ranger sat in the back again, watching through the windshield as though every turn brought back another piece of an old routine. The rescue SUV followed. Emily endured another contraction while they were halfway through the lane. Janet coached her breathing, Nathan holding one hand while trying to hide his fear. When the contraction passed, Emily opened her eyes and whispered, "Tell Evelyn I owe her a new fence." Janet smiled. "I think she prefers old ones." 20 minutes later, Evelyn's Ford emerged onto East Prairie Road. For the first time that afternoon, Claire saw plowed pavement. A county deputy's SUV and a Prairie Hollow ambulance waited near the junction, with emergency lights flashing through the snow. The ambulance crew transferred Emily immediately. Nathan climbed in beside her. Janet remained with them. Wade stood in the road watching the ambulance pull away toward town. His face looked 10 years older than it had that morning. He turned toward Evelyn. "Thank you." There was nothing else in his voice. Evelyn nodded once. By 6:20 p.m., Emily had reached Prairie Hollow Community Hospital, a small 12-bed facility serving the surrounding farming region. Dr. Helen Ward, the 61-year-old physician on call, met her in the emergency department. Helen was a compact woman with short, silver-streaked hair, dark-rimmed glasses, and the calm efficiency of someone who had delivered babies in snowstorms, thunderstorms, and once during a county-wide power failure. She examined Emily and determined that labor was progressing steadily, but without signs of immediate distress. The baby waited until morning. At 7:14 a.m., Emily gave birth to a healthy girl, weighing 7 pounds, 6 ounces. Nathan sent Wade a photograph. Within an hour, Wade showed it to nearly everyone who answered his calls. And somewhere between the rescue radio chatter, the county road crew, the hospital staff, and the farmers checking on one another, another story began spreading through Prairie Hollow. Evelyn Mercer's road had stayed open. Not the county road, not the expensive new route everyone had trusted. The road behind the old rusted fence. By afternoon, the storm weakened enough for Wade to reach the Mercer farm. He arrived alone. No jokes, no comments about junkyards or prisons for cattle. Evelyn was clearing snow from the generator shed when he approached. Wade stood beside her for several seconds. "How long did you know?" Evelyn brushed snow from her gloves. "Know what?" "That this was going to happen." "I didn't," Wade frowned. "You built all that before the storm. I prepared for what could happen." "That isn't the same thing?" "No." She looked toward the snow-covered fields. "Nobody knows what a storm will do. I just know wind usually finds the place we forgot to protect." Wade looked toward the back road and nodded slowly. The weather radio inside the house interrupted them before either could say more. Claire turned up the volume. A second winter system had formed farther northwest than expected. It was projected to reach western Kansas in 3 days. The first storm had barely left. Road crews were still clearing drifts. Several farms remained difficult to reach. And unlike Evelyn, most of them had no alternate route protected from the wind. Wade looked at the radio, then at the snow fence, then back at Evelyn. 3 days. Evelyn had prepared one farm. Now the question was whether 3 days could possibly be enough to help an entire community prepare for what was coming next. The next morning, Prairie Hollow woke beneath a brittle blue sky and a temperature of 15 degrees Fahrenheit. The first storm had moved east during the night, leaving behind miles of hard-packed drifts, buried fence corners, half-cleared county roads, and the strange silence that often followed dangerous weather. The wind had dropped to less than 10 miles per hour, but the radio repeated the same warning every half hour. A second system was building over the central Rockies and could reach western Kansas within 2 days. At the Mercer farm, Evelyn was carrying split firewood from the shed when a diesel engine rumbled up the lane. Wade Sutton climbed down from his pickup. This time, he did not arrive with coffee, jokes, or an opinion. A heavy gasoline-powered post driver was strapped into the truck bed. He lowered the tailgate. "Where do you want me?" Evelyn looked at the machine, then at Wade. "That depends." "On what?" "Whether you came to help or supervise." Wade almost smiled. "Help." It was the shortest argument the two of them had ever had. 20 minutes later, another tractor appeared from the north, pulling a flat wagon loaded with steel posts. It belonged to Dale Brennan, a 63-year-old cattle rancher whose property bordered County 14, 2 miles beyond the Sutton place. Dale was tall and thin, with a long neck, deeply sunken cheeks, and hands permanently stained by grease and livestock work. He was known around Prairie Hollow as a man who spoke only when necessary and trusted anything mechanical more than most people. The first storm had buried his southern entrance so completely that he had spent nearly 6 hours opening it with a front-end loader. Behind him came Mason Bell, 51, shorter and heavier than Dale, with reddish-gray hair, a round face, and the kind of restless energy that made him repair something while carrying on a conversation. Mason farmed wheat and milo east of town. One of his fields fed directly into a notorious drifting section of County Road, though until the previous storm he had never thought of the field itself as part of the problem. Dale climbed down from his tractor. "Wade says you're the reason the ambulance route stayed open." "I'm one reason." Mason looked toward the snow fence. "I drove past that thing 3 weeks ago. So did half the county. I thought it looked ridiculous." Wade folded his arms. "You're late. I already used that line." Claire came from the barn carrying a clipboard and stopped when she saw the 3 men standing beside Evelyn. "Well," she said, "this feels different." Before anyone answered, a yellow county pickup turned into the lane. Cal Turner stepped out with a folded map tucked beneath one arm. Unlike the others, Cal did not head immediately toward the house. He walked straight to the snow fence. He studied the massive drift still lying behind it, then paced the distance from the fence to the back road. He crouched twice, digging through the remaining powder to see where the main deposit began and where the wind-scoured surface ended. Evelyn watched him from the yard. After 10 minutes, Cal finally walked back. "You put the entire thing on your property?" "Yes." "Nothing inside the county right-of-way?" "No." "And you set it back far enough that the main drift formed before the road?" "That was the purpose." Cal unfolded his map on the hood of his pickup. "Yesterday, our grader cleared the north end of 14 twice. By the time it came back around, parts of the first pass were half filled again. Your back road needed maybe one light pass in a couple places." Wade glanced at Evelyn. She said nothing. Cal traced a finger along the map. "If we could force more drifting to happen here, here, and along these 3 open stretches, we'd reduce what the plows have to remove." Mason leaned over the hood. "So do it." Cal looked at him. "With what?" "Fence. The county doesn't have several thousand feet of snow fence sitting around." "Buy it." "With what money 2 days before a storm?" That ended the suggestion quickly. Cal explained that county budgets were approved months in advance. Even if emergency funds were available, ordering enough commercial snow fence, posts, and hardware would take longer than the forecast allowed. Equipment was not the only problem. Several of the worst drifting areas bordered private agricultural land. The county could not simply drive onto farms and install structures wherever it wished. Evelyn listened until Cal finished. Then she walked toward the machine shed. "Come with me." Behind the shed lay the material Claire had once called enough rusty fencing to disappoint an entire subdivision. Dozens of steel panels remained stacked against a windbreak. Several bundles of straight T-posts rested beneath a tarp. Shorter pieces salvaged from damaged panels had been sorted by length. There were coils of older wire and a barrel filled with clips, bolts, and miscellaneous hardware Evelyn had refused to throw away. Mason stared at it. "You still have all that?" "Bought more than I needed." Wade looked at the stacks. "For $475. Evelyn nodded. Nobody laughed. Harold Boone arrived shortly after 10, summoned by Claire. The 72-year-old retired fence builder stepped carefully over the icy ground with an old compass hanging from a cord around his neck and several sheets of paper tucked into his coat. His right knee was stiffer in the cold than it had been during their first build, but his mind remained sharp. Claire spread Cal's county map across the kitchen table. They began with memory. Which roads drifted first? Which ditches filled? Where did the wind cross hundreds of acres without shelter belts, trees, buildings, or terrain to slow it? Cal marked locations from county maintenance records. Dale marked the places he had personally plowed with his tractor over the years. Mason identified 2 exposed sections along his wheat fields. Wade added the stretch near the Sutton property where County 14 had disappeared. Claire organized everything into a simple list and circled 5 sites that repeatedly came up. Harold stood at the window for a long moment, watching dry snow stream lightly from the top of the old drift. "Northwest is still the main problem if the forecast holds," he said. "But don't copy Evelyn's angle everywhere. Every field has a different opening." He used the compass and aerial map to estimate the expected wind direction across each property. Then he helped them choose positions far enough upwind to encourage the largest deposits away from road shoulders. Cal drew thick red lines showing county rights of way. "Nothing goes inside these without authorization." Wade frowned. "That leaves some fence pretty far from the road." "That's the point," Claire said. She realized only after speaking that she now sounded like Evelyn. By noon, the first materials began leaving the Mercer farm. Then word spread. Not through any official announcement, through phone calls. Wade called his brother. Mason called 2 farmers east of town. Cal mentioned the plan over county radio. Travis Cole heard about it at the repair shop. By 1 o'clock, pickups started arriving. One farmer brought 20 old T-posts that had been leaning behind his barn for a decade. Another brought woven wire fencing removed from a cattle pen. A retired school custodian arrived with 2 rolls of orange marking tape. Someone else brought chain, post clips, and a hydraulic driver. A young ranch couple supplied a skid loader. Nothing matched. Very little was new. Evelyn seemed entirely comfortable with that. By early afternoon, crews spread across the 5 selected locations. Cal coordinated with each landowner, making sure the barriers stayed on private ground and did not interfere with drainage, driveways, or county maintenance. Harold moved between sites checking orientation. Claire remained in the pickup with maps, marking completed sections and radioing measurements to the crews. Ranger rode with Evelyn for part of the afternoon but eventually chose a patch of sunlight beside the Mercer truck and lay there while humans hauled steel around him. His silver muzzle rested on his front paws as he watched strangers turn what had once been Evelyn's strange private project into something larger. Wade drove posts. Dale straightened bent steel with the tractor. Mason hauled fencing. Cal abandoned his clean county gloves after the first hour and worked barehanded until Evelyn threw him a spare pair. At one location, they realized there was not enough full-length paneling to complete the planned line. Mason looked at the remaining pile. "That's it?" Evelyn pointed toward several shorter sections. "Overlap them." They won't look good. Evelyn stared at him. Mason laughed. Right. Forgot who I was talking to. They overlapped the pieces. By 3:30, the first 4 locations were finished. The last site lay northwest of Prairie Hollow, beside a broad, harvested field belonging to Dale. That section of County Road had been buried under nearly 5 feet of drift during the first storm. The crew worked faster now, not carelessly, but with an awareness of the sky. The western horizon had changed. A line of dark gray cloud was spreading above the plains. The temperature was falling again. Harold stood beside the final section while Wade locked the last panel to a post. Another 6 inches, Harold said. Wade adjusted the panel. There? Good. The post driver struck one final time. Then the engine shut off. For the first time all afternoon, the field became quiet. Evelyn looked along the line. Hundreds of yards of mismatched steel stretched across the open Kansas landscape. Some panels were rusted, some were silver, some leaned slightly differently from their neighbors. A few sections were woven wire rather than cattle panel. Nothing about it looked like a professionally purchased public works project. 3 weeks earlier, most of it had been considered scrap. Now farmers stood beside it, hoping it would protect roads their families depended on. Claire walked over to Evelyn. You realize what happened today? Evelyn kept looking at the fence. People got cold. They listened to you. Storm did most of the explaining. Claire smiled. Wade approached from behind them. I still think the fence is ugly. Evelyn glanced at him. That's brave of you. But I'm learning not to judge ugly things during good weather. That earned a laugh from Harold. Cal closed his map and looked toward the clouds. County crews start at 4 tomorrow morning. If these do half what yours did, it buys us time. Evelyn did not promise him anything. Snow fences did not stop storms. They did not guarantee open roads. They only changed where some of the snow chose to settle. But sometimes changing the location of failure was enough. The crews packed up just before sunset. As Evelyn drove home, Ranger sat beside Claire in the back seat, tired enough to sleep through the bumps. Outside the window, the new fences appeared one after another across the darkening fields. No longer one woman's experiment. No longer something Prairie Hollow laughed at. By 8 o'clock that night, the wind began to rise. Evelyn stepped onto her porch. Ranger joined her and stood silently at her side. The northwest horizon had disappeared behind cloud. Somewhere beyond the darkness, loose snow was already beginning to move across the plains. For the first time, an entire community had placed its faith in an idea they had mocked only weeks before. By morning, the second storm would decide whether Evelyn had taught Prairie Hollow something worth remembering, or simply taught everyone how to fail together. The second storm reached Prairie Hollow before dawn 2 days later. At 5:20 a.m., the temperature had fallen to 11 degrees Fahrenheit, and the sky over western Kansas was hidden behind a moving wall of gray-white snow. The system was stronger at its peak than the first one, but moving faster, bringing fewer total hours of snowfall and another round of hard northwest wind. Gusts crossed the open plains at more than 45 miles per hour, scraping loose snow from harvested fields and driving it low across the ground in long white ribbons. From the kitchen window of the Mercer farmhouse, Evelyn could hear the wind pressing against the walls and see almost nothing beyond the nearest reflector stakes. Ranger stood beside her for several minutes, his old left ear twitching at every deeper gust, before he finally settled near the stove. Claire sat at the table with Cal Turner's county map open in front of her, listening to the road crew radio through a borrowed handheld unit. This time, however, the voices coming through the static sounded different. There was urgency, but not confusion. By sunrise, the new snow fences were beginning to do what everyone had hoped. Northwest of Wade Sutton's property, an enormous drift formed along the mismatched steel panels they had installed 2 days earlier. Along Dale Brennan's wheat ground, wind pushed loose snow across nearly half a mile of open field before the barrier slowed it enough for the snow to settle. The ridge grew steadily behind the fence instead of building directly across the county road. Near Mason Bell's place, a section assembled from cattle panels, woven wire, and old T-posts produced an uneven but useful line of accumulation far from the shoulder. The fences did not stop the snow. They did not make the storm gentle. They simply encouraged much of the snow to fall in places where it could do less harm. County roads still required plowing. Some stretches still drifted shut temporarily. One low section south of town collected enough snow to slow traffic to a crawl, and another curve near a shelter belt needed repeated attention. But the roads did not disappear the way they had during the first storm. Cal understood the difference before noon. During the previous blizzard, his crew had wasted precious hours reopening the same exposed stretches again and again because the wind refilled them almost immediately. This time, the largest snow deposits had formed farther out on private land. Instead of chasing the same problem repeatedly, he could move his two working machines from one genuine obstruction to another. At 10:15, he radioed the greater crew. "Finish Brennan's corner once and move east. Don't circle back unless somebody reports it closing." During the first storm, that instruction would have been impossible. Claire heard it from the Mercer kitchen. She looked at Evelyn. "You heard that?" Evelyn was pouring coffee. "I heard. You could at least look pleased." "I'll be pleased when the wind stops." Claire shook her head, smiling. By mid-afternoon, the storm had reached its worst. Visibility fell below a quarter mile in exposed places, and Cal temporarily advised residents to remain home unless travel was essential. Yet the county did not completely lose access to the farms along the newly protected sections. Wade called once to report that his entrance was still usable. Dale managed to reach his cattle across the northern pasture without spending half a day digging out his lane. Mason drove his tractor to check a water tank and returned without needing to push through a road drift. Nothing about the storm became easy. But difficult and impossible were not the same thing. The wind began weakening shortly after midnight. By sunrise the next morning, Prairie Hollow emerged into a landscape reshaped by snow. White ridges rose across open fields like low, frozen dunes. The newly erected fences were partly buried behind enormous drifts, some so deep that only the top rails remained visible. Yet beyond those drifts, stretches of county road appeared as dark ribbons of gravel and packed snow. Cal's crews worked through the morning. By afternoon, nearly every priority road was passable. No farm in the immediate Prairie Hollow area remained cut off for days. No rescue vehicle had to search for an improvised route across forgotten pasture. No family stood at a window waiting for a snowplow that could not reach them. For Evelyn, that was enough. Winter eventually loosened its grip on western Kansas. February gave way to March, and the white fields turned first to mud and then gradually back to brown-green pasture. The enormous drifts behind the snow fences shrank into dirty ridges before disappearing entirely, leaving flattened grass and bits of cornstalk trapped against the steel. By April, the county had gathered enough information from the two storms to begin something more formal. Cal proposed a small, seasonal snow fence trial, focused on a handful of rural road sections with a history of severe drifting. The county would not build permanent structures across private property. Instead, participating landowners could volunteer strips of ground where temporary or existing fencing could be positioned during winter, safely outside the county right-of-way. Road crews would document which locations reduced drifting enough to justify repeating the program the following year. It was modest. No ribbon cutting, no television crews, no grand government project. Just a practical idea supported by what everyone had seen with their own eyes. Wade Sutton became one of the first landowners to volunteer. By late spring, he had already begun collecting used cattle panels from his own property. When Evelyn saw them stacked beside his barn one afternoon, she pointed through the truck window. "Starting a junkyard?" Wade looked at her for a long second. Then he laughed so hard he had to lean against the tailgate. That one was earned. He built his own snow fence system before the following winter, this time asking Evelyn and Harold to check the placement before he drove the first post. Harold Boone became an unofficial advisor to the county trial. At 72, his knee complained after long days in the field, so he stopped doing most of the heavy driving and lifting. Instead, He carried his compass, studied maps, corrected fence angles, and told younger volunteers when they were about to repeat mistakes he had seen 30 years earlier. He claimed retirement had finally improved because people had learned to let him point while somebody else carried the posts. Claire changed too. She had originally returned to Prairie Hollow believing her stay with Evelyn would be temporary. Denver remained an option in her mind for months, a place associated with better salaries, larger clinics, and the life she assumed she was supposed to build. But somewhere between the first rusted panel, Emily Sutton's rescue, and the sight of neighbors working together beneath a darkening winter sky, Claire stopped thinking of Prairie Hollow as the place she had retreated to. It began to feel like somewhere she had chosen. That spring, she accepted a veterinary technician position at the small local clinic serving Prairie Hollow and several surrounding farming communities. The salary was lower than Denver. The building was older. Half her patients arrived covered in mud. She was happier. Evelyn did none of the things people later joked she ought to have done. She did not start a snow fence company. She did not patent anything. She did not sell seminars about surviving winter. She certainly did not become rich. She repaired cath pens, checked water tanks, mended ordinary fences, changed tractor oil, complained about feed prices, and continued running the same 320 acres she had shared with Thomas. The rusted Barrow Creek fencing remained exactly what it had always been, old steel put to another use. On a cold morning near the end of the following winter, Claire walked with Evelyn to the back field after a smaller overnight storm. The sun had risen beneath a clear blue sky, making every patch of snow glitter painfully bright. A long white wall stood behind the original snow fence, smooth along the top where the night wind had shaped it. Beyond the drift, the back road remained visible. A narrow brown-gray line crossed the winter landscape almost untouched. Ranger lay in a patch of sun near Evelyn's boots. At 10 now, he moved more slowly than he once had. More silver had spread across his face, and after longer walks he sometimes favored his rear legs, but his dark eyes remained attentive. He rested his graying muzzle across his front paws and watched the field as though supervising it. Claire stood beside Evelyn. For several minutes neither woman spoke. Finally, Claire nodded toward the fence. "Did you know they would work that well?" Evelyn considered the question. "No." Claire looked at her. "No?" "No." "Then why did you do it?" Evelyn looked beyond the rusted steel toward the road. "Because preparing doesn't mean knowing exactly what will happen." She paused. "It means not waiting until it happens to start thinking." Claire looked at the fence again. The panels were still bent in places. The rust had not vanished. Some rails came from different manufacturers. Several posts leaned slightly. To anyone arriving in Prairie Hollow without knowing the story, the whole thing might still have looked like scrap arranged across an empty field for no sensible reason. Perhaps that was the lesson people remembered most. Value had never appeared because the steel changed. The people looking at it had changed. 3 weeks before the first storm, those old panels had been unwanted leftovers from a failed cattle operation. During the blizzard, they became the difference between a road disappearing and a road remaining usable. Later, the idea behind them gave an entire community more choices when winter returned. The wind had not been defeated. Prairie Hollow had simply learned to stop fighting it in the wrong place. Evelyn rested one hand lightly on Ranger's head. Far across the field, a pickup traveled safely along the back road. And beneath the pale Kansas winter sun, the old rusted fence continued doing the quiet job no one had believed it could do. Sometimes the thing that saves a road is not the strongest thing, the newest thing, or the most expensive thing. Sometimes it is simply the thing someone had the wisdom to put in the right place before the storm arrived. Sometimes a miracle does not arrive with thunder from the heavens. Sometimes God places it quietly in front of us, hidden inside an old fence, a forgotten road, a lesson learned many years ago, or the wisdom of someone the world stopped listening to. Evelyn never knew exactly what the storm would bring. She simply prepared with the knowledge God had allowed her to gather through a lifetime of hardship, loss, patience, and experience. And when the wind finally came, the rusty fencing that everyone laughed at became part of the path that helped save a mother and her unborn child. That is something worth remembering in our own lives. We may not know what tomorrow will bring. We may face sickness, loss, loneliness, financial struggles, or storms that no weather forecast can predict. But we can prepare our hearts with faith, kindness, patience, and courage. We can use what God has already placed in our hands instead of waiting for something perfect to appear. Sometimes what looks useless today may become a blessing tomorrow. Sometimes the person everyone ignores may carry the wisdom everyone will eventually need. And sometimes God does not remove the storm. He gives us the strength, the people, and the path we need to walk through it. If this story touched your heart, please share it with someone who may need a little hope today. Tell us in the comments what lesson you learned from Evelyn and Ranger. And if you believe God can bring purpose from things the world has forgotten, comment Amen below. Please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and stay with us for more stories about faith, courage, animals, and the quiet miracles that can still be found in everyday life. May God bless you and your family. May He protect your home, guide you through every difficult road, give you strength when the storm comes, and remind you that even when you cannot see the way ahead, you are never walking alone. Amen.